Hi everyone! This video walks us through the Commission's 2025 annual report, focusing on sentencing data for adult felony cases that were sentenced in 2025, as well as how sentencing trends have changed over the last 10 years. The report also provides an overview of the Commission's main projects and accomplishments throughout 2025, as well as a review of the current year guidelines manual. Though for this presentation, we are going to focus on the data. Before getting into the trends, I want to take a moment and highlight some key points about the Commission's data. The first is that the Commission reports on adult felony sentences only. Juveniles are not included in any of the analyses produced by the Commission. Second, the Commission only receives data for sentences that were imposed in D.C. Superior Court. Any D.C. code convictions that were not sentenced in D.C. Superior Court are excluded from the analyses. So, all analyses presented in the Commission's annual report are limited to adult felony cases that were sentenced in D.C. Superior Court. And lastly, the analyses presented in the report are performed on the case level, where each case is represented by the most severe count that was sentenced on a given case. This is because the most severe count is generally reflective of the overall sentence on a case. Now, let's get into the data. Starting with the very basics, this chart shows the historical trends for the number of counts, cases, and individuals sentenced each year. In 2024, we saw a really dramatic increase in sentences, where all three metrics increased by about 50% when compared to 2023. And this kind of leveled off in 2025. We didn't see a continued increase, but there was a slight 5% reduction in the number of counts, cases, and individuals sentenced when compared to 2024. And if we ignore our COVID blip, this decrease does align with pre-pandemic trends, especially in regard to the number of cases and sentenced individuals, as you can see by this yellow trend line. Something new we did this year was look at felony case filing trends. In 2024, there were 2,929 felony cases filed. This increased by 44%, jumping to 4,204 cases in 2025, so a really substantial increase. When we break this down by case file month, we see that the increase is most prominent beginning in August of 2025. Specifically between September and December of 2025, the number of cases filed is more than double than what we saw during those same months in 2024. The data shows that felony cases take about 11 months to progress through the court system, so 80% of the cases filed between August and December are still pending. So it will be really interesting to see how the 2026 numbers and trends play out, and this is something that the Commission will be monitoring moving forward. On that same topic, naturally, an increase in case filings is correlated to an increase in arrests. In 2025, there were 6,501 adult felony arrests, which is 734 more, or a 12% increase from 2024. This is the greatest number of arrests and also the greatest papering rate of 79% observed by the Commission since we started tracking this data back in 2018. If we focus in on the 2025 arrest to sentencing trends, again, we see that there were a total of 6,501 arrests. 79% of them were papered, generating a total of 5,420 cases. As of January 12th, 22% of these cases were closed without conviction, 53% were pending, and 25% resulted in a finding of guilt for any criminal offense. Now looking at the sentence type distribution. And as I mentioned in the beginning, almost all analyses in the annual report are done on the case level, where each case is represented by the most severe count that was sentenced. So here, sentence type is the type of sentence that was imposed for the most severe count on a given case. And in 2025, we saw some fluctuation with the sentence type trends. Prison accounted for 55% of all sentences, dropping 6% from the all-time highs that we saw in 2023 and 2024. However, 55% is still above the historical average prison rate of 48%. This decrease in prison sentences was offset by increases in both short split and probation sentences. Short split increased from its all-time low of 14% to 16% in 2025, and probation increased from 26% to 29%. So this next chart shows the distribution of sentence type within each color-coded region of the main grid. And what I mean by that are the white boxes, dark blue boxes, and light blue boxes. And this analysis shows that the color of the grid box does not determine the type of sentence that will be imposed. And that is one of the more common misconceptions about the guidelines. So each of these columns corresponds to a different color-coded region of the main grid, the far left being the white prison-only boxes, the middle being the dark blue short split boxes, and the far right being the light blue probation boxes. Focusing on this far right column, which again represents the light blue region of the main grid, you'll see that of all the cases that fell in a probation eligible box, only half actually received a probation sentence. 17% of these cases received a short split sentence and 32% received a prison sentence. This is a slightly different distribution than what we saw in 2024, where 43% received probation, 20% received short split, and 37% received prison. So in 2025, there was an increase in probation sentences in probation eligible boxes. This pie chart shows the breakdown of the cases sentenced in 2025 by offense type. Violent and weapons offenses were the two most frequently sentenced categories and represented about 63% of all felony cases when combined. This is a slight decrease from last year, which is primarily attributed to a decrease in weapons cases. In 2024, weapons cases accounted for 37% of all felony cases, but in 2025, this dropped to 32%. And that was offset by minor increases, about 2%, in both property and violent offenses. Now getting into guidelines compliance. Last year, the overall compliance rate was 97.9%, which is consistent with historical trends. We've been hovering around the 97-98% mark since 2018. Most of these sentences were compliant in the box, meaning that both the sentence type and length were within the guidelines recommendation. 4.4% were outside the box compliant, meaning that the sentence was outside of the guidelines recommendation, but were still considered compliant either because the judge cited a departure factor or the sentence was the result of a Rule 11C1C plea, for example. This means that 2.1%, or 43 counts, were non-compliant with the guidelines in 2025. All but 2 of these counts were downward departures, meaning that the sentence type or sentence length were below the guidelines recommendation. Most of these non-compliant sentences were classified as non-compliant splits, which means that the sentence imposed is within the guidelines recommended sentencing range, but the sentence to serve after time has been suspended is below the bottom of the range, but is greater than 6 months. It's not included in this presentation, but the report also features 2 full arrested sentencing analyses for gun possession offenses, one for 2025 and one that is updated from 2024. We also have a sentence length analysis that is broken down by offense type as well as frequently sentenced offenses. So I highly recommend checking those out if you haven't already. So that concludes this presentation. Thank you all for tuning in. Be sure to check out the full copy of the 2025 annual report, which is linked in the description. Feel free to contact the Commission with any questions you may have, either about the annual report or broader data and research capabilities. Thank you for watching.